Princess Zoraya stood at the palace window, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. The skies were painted in hues of pink and purple as the twin moons began to rise. The celebrations of victory still echoed in the palace halls, but in her heart, Zoraya felt a strange emptiness. The empire was safe, the war was over, and yet something was missing. Her thoughts drifted back to the days before the war. She had grown up in the grand halls of the palace, surrounded by luxury and comfort. Her childhood had been filled with laughter, games, and endless days spent in the gardens with her closest friend, Tyrion. He had been her companion, her protector, and her most trusted confidant. But after the war began, he had disappeared without a trace. She never saw him again, and life went on. But today, everything had changed. Zoraya had been preparing for the royal banquet to celebrate the end of the war. Her people were joyous, their homes rebuilt, their futures secured. Yet, amidst the cheers, her mind kept returning to one question. What had happened to Tyrion? Where had he gone? Why had he vanished when the war started? As if the universe had answered her unspoken question, a servant entered the room. She bowed deeply, her face filled with excitement. "Your Highness, there is someone here to see you. He requests an audience." Zoraya turned, her heart skipping a beat. "Who is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The servant hesitated, a small smile creeping onto her lips. "It is Tyrion, Your Highness." Tyrion. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. The childhood friend she had not seen in years, the boy who had been by her side through thick and thin. Zoraya's heart raced. She had never expected this moment to come, not after all this time. "Show him in," Zoraya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Moments later, Tyrion entered the room. He was not the same young boy she remembered. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, and his face, though still familiar, had the hardened look of someone who had seen too much. The softness of his youth was gone, replaced by the serious gaze of a soldier. But even with the changes, there was something in his eyes, something that made Zoraya's heart ache. "Zoraya," he said, his voice deep and steady, though there was a hint of nervousness behind it. "It's been so long." She blinked, almost unable to speak. The years seemed to melt away as she looked at him. "Tyrion, I can't believe it's really you." Her voice caught in her throat. He smiled, a small but genuine smile that reminded her of the carefree days when they would run through the palace gardens, their laughter filling the air. But that smile quickly faded as his eyes fell to the floor, his expression turning serious. "I'm sorry I vanished," Tyrion said, his voice filled with regret. "I never meant to leave you without an explanation, but I had no choice." Zoraya took a step forward, her heart racing. "Where did you go? Why did you leave? You just disappeared and I—" "Zoraya," Tyrion interrupted gently, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "I had to go. There was something more, important than our childhood, something bigger than both of us." His words left Zoraya confused and unsettled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Tyrion took a deep breath before continuing, his eyes hardening. "The war. I had to fight. I had to join the army. The fate of the empire depended on it. I couldn't stay in the palace living a life of luxury while my people were dying." Zoraya was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had heard the stories of the great war hero Ares, who had led the army to victory and turned the tide of battle. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that Tyrion, her childhood friend, was the legendary soldier. The boy she had once played with in the palace gardens was now the hero who had saved their empire. "You—" Zoraya stammered, unable to finish the thought. You were Ares? Tyrion nodded solemnly. Yes, I was. But I couldn't tell anyone. My identity had to remain a secret for the sake of the mission. I couldn't afford to be a symbol. I needed to be a soldier. Zoraya's heart ached. The boy who had once shared her dreams and fears, the boy who had been her closest friend, had become someone completely different. He had been fighting on the front lines, risking his life for the Empire, while she had been living in safety, surrounded by the comforts of the royal life. I didn't want to leave you, Tyrion continued, his voice tinged with sadness, but I had no choice. I had to do my duty. For you. For all of us. Zoraya's eyes welled up with tears. She had always admired Tyrion's strength, but now she saw the true weight of the burden he had carried. He had given up everything for the Empire. His childhood, his family, and even his love for her. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You don't have to apologize, Tyrion. I understand now. You did what you had to do, but why didn't you come back? Why didn't you tell me what was happening? Tyrion sighed deeply, his expression pained. I wanted to, more than anything, but there were too many eyes on me, too many dangers. I had to keep my distance to protect both of us. Zoraya nodded slowly, trying to make sense of it all. She had always known Tyrion to be a man of honor, but hearing this, she realized just how much he had sacrificed. He had been fighting for something greater than himself, for a future they could both be proud of. As the two of them stood in the quiet room, the weight of the years apart seemed to hang in the air. Zoraya could feel the bond between them still strong, despite the distance of time and war. And as she looked into his eyes, she knew one thing for certain. Tyrion had never truly left her. He had been with her all along, even in the darkest moments of the war. I'm glad you're here, Zoraya said softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm glad we're together again. The days that followed Tyrion's return were filled with mixed emotions. Zoraya could hardly focus on the duties of her royal role. Each time she passed a mirror or caught a glimpse of herself in a reflective surface, she saw not just the princess of the Empire, but a woman struggling to understand the truth that had been kept from her for so long. She had spent countless nights lying awake, her mind racing. The war hero Ares, he had been Tyrion all along, the boy she had once known, with whom she had spent endless hours laughing and running through the palace gardens, was now a soldier who had saved the galaxy. How could that be? How could the carefree friend she had known become such a legend? Despite his confession, there was still so much about Tyrion's transformation that didn't add up. There were moments when they would talk for hours, when Zoraya could see the burden he carried. His eyes had lost the brightness of youth, replaced by a deep, almost permanent sadness. Every time he spoke of the war, his voice became distant, as if he were remembering things he didn't want to. But even more than that, there was a strange feeling Zoraya couldn't shake, an unsettling feeling that Tyrion was holding something back, something important. Something that went beyond the pain of battle or the weight of a soldier's duty. She couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. One evening after the sun had set and the stars began to twinkle above the palace, Zoraya wandered through the royal gardens. The cool evening air brushed against her face as she thought about everything that had happened. Tyrion had always been an open book to her, but now he seemed so closed off, as if there were walls he had built around. Himself, walls she couldn't tear down. Zoraya's steps were slow, deliberate, as she walked along the garden's stone paths. She passed by the fountain, where she and Tyrion had spent hours as children, tossing coins into the water and making wishes. The memories flooded her mind, and she felt a sharp ache in her chest. She wanted to ask him more, to understand why. He had left so suddenly, why he hadn't confided in her, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the truth. It was then that she heard a soft voice call her name. "Princess Zoraya." She turned and saw Tyrion approaching, his figure framed by the dim light of the garden lanterns. He looked as handsome as ever, his strong features sharp in the low light, but there was an unreadable expression on his face. "Tyrion," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "What are you doing here?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I could ask you the same thing. I thought you'd be in the throne room preparing for tomorrow's meeting." Zoraya looked away, suddenly feeling a sense of vulnerability she hadn't felt before. "I needed some air," she said quietly. There was a brief silence between them. The soft rustling of leaves in the breeze was the only sound that filled the space. Zoraya watched him closely, trying to read his expression, but it was hard to know what he was thinking. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Zoraya hesitated. Should she ask him now? Should she confront him about the growing doubts she had in her heart? Every time they spoke, the weight of unspoken words seemed to grow heavier. But there was still so much she didn't understand. Tyrion had been to places she would never know, seen things she would never experience. He had been through the flames of war, and yet he still stood before her, a man who had become a hero. But at what cost? Zoraya began, but her voice faltered. "I don't know what to think anymore. You've changed so much, Tyrion. You're no longer the boy I knew. You're Ares, the war hero, and yet I don't feel like I truly know you anymore." Tyrion looked down, a flicker of sadness passing across his face. "I understand," he said softly. "I never wanted to be someone you couldn't recognize, but the truth is, I had no choice. I had to become something else to survive the war. I had to push everything else away. The memories, the people, even you. I couldn't afford to hold on to the past when the future of the Empire was at stake." Zoraya's heart twisted in her chest. "But you're here now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So why can't you let me in? Why can't you let me understand what you've been through?" "You're not just Ares, Tyrion. You're still my friend, the one I grew up with. You still have a place in my life." Tyrion looked up at her then, his gaze intense, but there was something in his eyes that made Zoraya shiver. "I don't know if I can let anyone in," he admitted, his voice tinged with a raw honesty. "I've seen too much, Zoraya. I've done things I'm not proud of. There are things I can never forget." Zoraya took a step closer, her heart beating faster. "I'm not asking you to forget. I just want you to be honest with me. All this time, I thought I knew you, but now, it feels like I'm losing you to the shadows of the war. I want to help you, Tyrion. I don't want to lose you again." For a moment, there was silence. Then Tyrion reached out, gently brushing, his hand against hers. "You never lost me, Zoraya, but I've lost myself. And that's the hardest thing of all." Zoraya felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to say more, to ease the pain in his voice, but she didn't know how. She only knew that the man standing before her was not the same person she had known in her youth. He had been shaped by war, by sacrifice, and by the weight of 1,000 lives on his shoulders. But the person inside, her childhood friend, was still there, buried beneath the surface. "You don't have to face this alone," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm here. I always will be." Tyrion's grip on her hand tightened, and for a brief moment, Zoraya saw a flicker of the boy she had known, the boy who had been her closest friend. But it quickly vanished, replaced by the soldier he had become. With a heavy sigh, he pulled his hand away. "I wish it were that simple," he said. his voice cold once more. But it's not. There are things I can never tell you, Zoraya. Things that would change everything. Zoraya swallowed hard, a sense of unease settling in her chest. What could he be hiding? What was it that Tyrion couldn't or wouldn't tell her? She felt the familiar bond between them, but at the same time there was a chasm growing wider and wider. A chasm filled with secrets, and Zoraya feared that the deeper she went, the more she would uncover things she wasn't ready to face. As the night grew colder, Zoraya stepped back, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't answer. Tyrion watched her for a moment, and though his face was unreadable, Zoraya knew that this was far from over. There were still many pieces of this puzzle she had yet to discover. "Good night, Zoraya," Tyrion said, his voice softer now. "We'll talk again soon?" Zoraya nodded, her throat tight with unsaid words. As Tyrion turned and walked away, she stood alone in the garden, the weight of his silence pressing down on her. She had never felt more distant from him, and yet somehow she couldn't help but feel drawn closer. The next few days felt like a blur to Zoraya. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of Tyrion, the boy she had once known, the soldier who had become Ares, the hero of the Empire. She had tried to focus on her royal duties, attending meetings, listening to advisors, and ensuring that the peace was secured. But every moment, every passing second, her thoughts returned to him. Each time she saw him, it was as if the distance between them grew wider. The man standing before her was not the Tyrion she remembered. He had become someone else, someone colder, more distant, and yet still familiar in a way that made her heart ache. She couldn't stop wondering what had happened to him during the years he had been gone. What had he endured? What secrets was he hiding? Zoraya knew that something was wrong. There were still so many things unsaid between them, so many unanswered questions. Tyrion had confessed that he was Ares, the legendary war hero, but that was only part of the truth. There was more beneath the surface, and Zoraya was determined to find out what it was. One evening, as the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Zoraya made a decision. She would confront him. She would ask him the questions that had been burning in her heart, and she would not stop until she knew the full truth. After dinner, when the palace was quiet and most of the court had retired for the night, Zoraya walked to the royal gardens. The moonlight bathed the flowers and trees in a soft glow, and the sound of crickets filled the air. It was the perfect setting, peaceful, serene, and isolated from the world. She found Tyrion standing by the fountain, his back to her. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant as he stared into the water. For a moment, Zoraya hesitated. She could feel the tension between them, a palpable force that seemed to stretch the air itself. But she knew she had to do this. She couldn't keep living with uncertainty. "Tyrion," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. Zoraya saw the same sadness in his eyes, the same burden he had carried for so long. "Zoraya," he replied, his voice low and steady. "What brings you here?" "I need to understand," Zoraya said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I need to understand what happened to you. You're not the same person anymore, Tyrion. The Tyrion I knew would never have left me, never have disappeared without a word. So tell me, what changed? What happened during the war? What are you hiding from me?" Tyrion took a deep breath, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But the truth is, I had no choice. There were things I had to do, things I had to become. I couldn't let anyone get too close. I couldn't let anyone see who I really was, not after what I went through." Zoraya's heart tightened. "What did you go through, Tyrion? What happened to you that you can't share with me?" Tyrion looked down, his hands clenched at his sides. There are things I wish I could forget, he said softly. Things I wish I could undo, but I can't. I became Ares because I had no other choice. The war was brutal, Zoraya. The things I did, they haunt me every day. Zoraya's heart sank. She stepped closer to him, her voice gentle. Tyrion, you don't have to carry this burden alone. Whatever you've been through, whatever you've done, I'm here. You don't have to shut me out. He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and guilt. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I thought that if I could just be Ares, the hero the Empire needed, I could protect you. I could protect all of you. But in the process, I lost myself. I lost the person I used to be, the person you knew. Zoraya reached out, her hand resting on his arm. But I still see you, Tyrion. I see the person you are now, not just the soldier you became. And I want to understand. I want to know the truth, the whole truth. Tyrion's expression softened, but there was still a look of hesitation in his eyes. I'm not sure I can tell you everything, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. There are things that I swore I would never speak of, things that would change everything, and I'm not sure I'm ready to face them, let alone share them with you. Zoraya's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words, the depth of the secrets he was holding. It was clear that whatever he had been through during the war had shaped him in ways she couldn't understand, but she also knew that she couldn't let him carry this burden alone. She couldn't let the past control their future. You don't have to face it alone, Tyrion, she said softly. I'm here for you. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You don't have to keep this wall between us. Tyrion stood still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. There's something I never told you, Zoraya, he began. Something I've kept hidden all these years. When I left, when I joined the war, it wasn't just because of duty. It was because of something that happened between us. Something that I didn't know how to deal with. Zoraya's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Tyrion looked away, his jaw tightening, as if the words were difficult to say. I loved you, Zoraya. I always have. But when I saw the Empire falling apart, when I saw people dying, I knew I had to become someone else. I had to bury my feelings, bury everything I had for you in order to survive. I thought that if I could just focus on the war, focus on being Ares, I could protect you. I could protect everyone. But I couldn't protect my heart. And that's the part of me that I've kept hidden from you all this time. Zoraya's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, a revelation that she had never expected. For years, she had thought Tyrion's departure had been about duty, about the war. But now she understood that it had been about something deeper, something that went beyond the battlefield. I never knew, Zoraya whispered, her heart racing. I never knew you felt that way. Tyrion looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret. I never wanted to put that burden on you, Zoraya. You were always meant for more than a soldier like me. I thought that if I stayed, I would only hold you back. I thought the best thing I could do was to disappear. Zoraya took a step closer, her hand gently cupping his cheek. Tyrion, she said softly, you never needed to disappear. You never needed to hide from me. I've always cared about you, too. For a moment there was silence. The only sound was the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. And then, as if the weight of years of silence had finally been lifted, Tyrion reached out and gently pulled Zoraya into his arms. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for everything. Zoraya rested her head against his chest, her heart full of emotions she didn't know how to express. She had always known that Tyrion was special, but now she understood just how much he had sacrificed. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Zoraya knew that the path ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the possibility of healing, of rebuilding their bond, and perhaps even something more. The days after their conversation in the garden were quieter, yet filled with an unsettling tension. Zoraya found herself torn between the royal duties that demanded her attention and the constant pull of her thoughts towards Tyrion. The air between them had shifted. What had once been a friendship had now evolved into something deeper, more complicated. But Zoraya didn't know how to navigate this new territory. Tyrion had been honest with her, but even now, she felt there was more to understand about him. He had carried a weight for so long, one that she couldn't fully comprehend. As the days passed, Zoraya noticed that Tyrion kept to himself more often. He was still present at the palace, still helping with the rebuilding efforts and offering his advice on military matters, but he seemed distant, as though the walls he had erected during the war were not so easily torn down. She could see it in his eyes. He was trying, but something was holding him back. Zoraya had always known Tyrion as someone who wore his emotions on his sleeve. The playful, carefree boy who had once laughed with her in the palace gardens was still there, but buried deep beneath layers of hardship and guilt. Zoraya understood why he had closed himself off. War had a way of changing a person. It had shaped him into a hero, yes, but it had also scarred him. The weight of that transformation was something she could not easily fix, no matter how much she wanted to. One evening, as Zoraya walked down the grand hall toward the royal chambers, she passed by a small room near the palace's eastern wing. It was a quiet room, usually left untouched, but tonight she heard faint voices from within. Curiosity piqued, she quietly approached the door and paused outside. From within, she could hear Tyrion speaking in hushed tones, his voice strained. "I'm telling you I can't keep doing this," he said, his words barely audible. "I thought I could handle it, being the soldier, being Ares, but I'm not sure how much longer I can wear this mask. I'm not the hero everyone thinks I am. I'm not even sure who I am anymore." Zoraya's heart sank as she leaned closer to the door. She recognized the voice of a man she had once known, but the weight of his words was unfamiliar to her. He had never seemed so broken. He had always been strong, resilient, but now it seemed as though the soldier she had admired was slowly unraveling. The other voice in the room was one of the royal advisors, a trusted man who had worked alongside Tyrion in the war. "You've carried the empire on your shoulders, Tyrion," the advisor said gently, "but you need to let go. You don't have to do this alone. You're not a machine. You're still human. It's okay to feel the weight of it. We all do." There was a long silence, and Zoraya could hear Tyrion let out a deep sigh. "I don't know how to stop. Every time I try, I feel like I'm betraying everything I've fought for, everything the people expect of me. I can't just let go, not when there's still so much left to do." The words hit Zoraya like a blow to the chest. She had always seen Tyrion as a pillar of strength, but now she realized that he was carrying more than just the physical scars of battle. He was burdened by the expectations of an entire empire, expectations that he had never asked for but had taken on nonetheless. The weight of those expectations had become his prison. Zoraya felt a wave of sympathy for him. She had always known that he was strong, but now she understood the depth of his struggles. The Empire might have hailed him as a hero, but no one truly understood the toll it had taken on him. Without thinking, Zoraya pushed open the door just slightly and stepped inside. Tyrion turned quickly at the sound, his face momentarily a mixture of surprise and something like shame. "Zoraya," he said quietly, standing quickly as if to hide something. I didn't expect anyone. She held up her hand to stop him. I heard, she said softly, her heart aching. I didn't mean to overhear, but I couldn't help it. Tyrion, I had no idea. Tyrion's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, he seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. I didn't want you to know, he muttered. I didn't. Want anyone to know how much I'm struggling? Zoraya stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to carry this alone, Tyrion. I'm here, remember? Not just as your princess, but as your friend. You don't have to be the hero anymore. Not for me. He looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and sorrow. But that's all I've ever been. A soldier. A hero. What else am I supposed to be? Zoraya placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and steady. You can be whatever you want to be. You don't have to live up to anyone's expectations but your own. The people love you because of what you've done, but I love you because of who you are. Don't lose sight of that. Tyrion closed his eyes for a moment, his breath shaking. I don't know how to find that person again, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The man I was before the war. I don't even know if he still exists. Zoraya took a deep breath and stood beside him. Then we'll find him together, she said softly. We can rebuild. It won't be easy, but we can start over, piece by piece. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, Tyrion. Not anymore. There was a long pause as Tyrion processed her words. His shoulders trembled slightly as if the weight of the years spent bearing the responsibility of an entire empire was finally beginning to crack. Zoraya! He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. I've always been so afraid of being weak, afraid of letting anyone see how much the war has broken me. But you make me feel like I can let go, even if just for a moment. Zoraya smiled gently, squeezing his arm. You don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to let your guard down. It's okay to be human. Tyrion met her gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a softness in his eyes, a flicker of the man he had once been. I don't know what the future holds, but maybe we can face it together. Zoraya's heart swelled with emotion as she nodded. Together. In that moment, the burden that had weighed so heavily on Tyrion seemed to lighten, just a little. He wasn't alone anymore, and for Zoraya, the path forward was clearer. She had always known that Tyrion was a hero, but now she saw him for who he truly was. A man, struggling, broken, but still capable of healing with the right support. As they stood together in the quiet room, a new understanding passed between them. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about expectations or titles. It was about finding peace within themselves and with each other. The days following their heart-to-heart in the palace gardens felt strangely peaceful. Zoraya had never imagined that the weight of the Empire's expectations, the burden of heroism, could have such a profound effect on Tyrion. He was no longer the man who walked with the aura of invincibility. Now he seemed more human, more fragile, yet still full of the strength that had made him Ares. But even as their bond deepened, Zoraya couldn't ignore the growing tension around them. The palace, though filled with celebrations and the promise of peace, was also filled with whispers. Some were from the nobles, others from the military advisors who had once fought beside Tyrion on the front lines. They praised him, of course, for his courage, his leadership, and his victory in the war. But there were also murmurs, whispers of distrust, of suspicion. Was Ares, the hero, truly loyal to the royal family? Or was he using his fame to build his own power? Zoraya overheard these whispers from time to time, and though she tried to ignore them, she knew they would not simply fade away. The truth was, that Tyrion had become more than just a soldier. He had become a symbol, a leader, and in the eyes of some, a potential rival to the throne. It was hard for Zoraya to understand this perspective. She had always seen Tyrion as her friend, the person who had once played games with her in the royal gardens, the boy who had been her closest confidant. But now, in the eyes of others, he was a threat, a soldier-turned-hero, and possibly someone who could challenge the royal family's power. The tension became apparent during one of the royal meetings. Zoraya sat at the head of the grand table, her advisors around her, all discussing the future of the empire and the rebuilding efforts. But as the discussion continued, her eyes wandered to Tyrion, who was sitting in the corner of the room, his expression unreadable. "Your Highness," said Lord Torrhen, a well-respected nobleman in the empire, "while we all acknowledge Ari's contributions to the war, we must consider the future of the military. The balance of power must remain in your hands, not in the hands of any one individual, no matter how heroic their past may be." Zoraya's gaze sharpened, but she said nothing. Tyrion, who had remained silent during the meeting, looked up at Lord Torrhen, his face unreadable. He wasn't the man he had been. During the war, he had grown more reserved, more thoughtful in his responses, and it was clear that this new version of Tyrion made some uncomfortable. "The Empire needs strong leadership," Lord Torrhen continued, his voice firm. "And while Ares is a hero, we must ensure that no one, not even him, can take control of the military without proper oversight. Your Highness, you must maintain control of the Empire's armed forces." Zoraya felt a pang in her chest. She had known these concerns would arise, but hearing them spoken so openly in front of Tyrion made her heart ache. She turned to him, her eyes searching for his reaction, but he only nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand the concerns, Lord Torrhen," Zoraya said, her voice calm, though her heart raced. "The military will remain under my command. We have made great strides toward peace, but we must not forget that the strength of the Empire lies in its unity, not in division." There was a brief silence in the room, and then another advisor, Lady Alina, spoke. "But, Your Highness, we cannot ignore the fact that Ares holds a great deal of influence over the military. Some may see him as a rival, and while we respect his role in the war, his growing power could pose a threat to the throne." Zoraya's heart sank. She had known that Tyrion's rise to power would be met with challenges, but hearing it from her closest advisors made the reality of the situation all too clear. She could not allow the Empire to fracture because of fear and suspicion. Tyrion remained quiet, his face calm, but Zoraya could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't angry. He was resigned. He had known that this would happen, and now it seemed that his worst fears were coming true. "Lord Torrhen, Lady Alina," Zoraya said, her voice now firm. "I understand your concerns, but I will not allow any doubt to creep into the hearts of my people. We must work together to ensure the future of the Empire, and that includes working with Ares, not against him." She turned to Tyrion then, her eyes meeting his. "You are more than a soldier, Tyrion. You are part of this family, and I will not let anyone question your loyalty. We must stand united, now more than ever." Tyrion nodded, though there was a deep sadness in his eyes. "I've never wanted anything more than to protect this empire," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that none in the room could ignore. "But if my presence is a threat to your rule, Zoraya, I will step aside. I never wanted power. I only wanted to ensure peace." Zoraya's heart clenched at his words. She could feel the weight of his sacrifices, his loyalty to her and to the Empire. He had fought for the future of the galaxy, but now it seemed that his very existence was under scrutiny. The Empire he had saved was now questioning his place in it. "No, Tyrion," Zoraya said firmly. "You will not step aside. The people need you, and I need you. Together, We can lead this empire into a new era, one built on trust, unity, and peace." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Zoraya knew the road ahead would not be easy. She would face resistance from within her own ranks, from the nobles and military leaders who feared the influence Tyrion held. But she also knew that Tyrion's strength, his honor, and his love for the Empire were what had saved them all. She would not allow that to be undermined by suspicion and fear. As the meeting adjourned, Zoraya remained seated at the head of the table. Tyrion had stood and left the room quietly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Zoraya's mind raced. She knew she would have to act quickly to solidify their position, to quell the whispers of rebellion and distrust before they could grow into something more dangerous. She stood and walked to the window, her gaze lost in the vast expanse of the city below. The Empire was hers to protect, and now, more than ever, it was clear that the real battle was not just for peace, it was for the unity of the people, for the loyalty of those she had come to trust. The next few days were filled with strategy and meetings. Zoraya knew that Tyrion's role in the military needed to be reaffirmed, and that the nobles needed to see that he was a part of the royal family, not a rival to it. The challenge was daunting, but Zoraya was determined. She would not let the Empire fall into chaos because of fear and distrust. She found Tyrion in the palace garden later that evening, his figure silhouetted against the fading light of the setting sun. He stood by the fountain, his back to her, lost in thought. "Tyrion," Zoraya called softly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "Maybe it would be easier for everyone if I stepped back, if I left the palace and went into seclusion, just for a while." Zoraya's heart ached. "No," she said firmly. "We don't get to decide the future by running away from it. You belong here, with me, by my side. Together, we'll make sure this empire stands strong. Together, we will show them that there is no power in division, only in unity." Tyrion hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'm with you, Zoraya. Always." And in that moment, Zoraya knew that despite the challenges, despite the doubts that would continue to circle them, the bond they shared, one, built on trust, loyalty, and love, was the strongest weapon they had, and no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. The palace was alive with energy, but beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewed. Zoraya had never felt the weight of the Empire's future quite like this. The peace they had fought for, the fragile balance of power that now held the Empire together, was constantly being tested. Every decision she made, every word spoken in meetings, every gesture had meaning. The stakes had never been higher. After the tense meeting with her advisors, Zoraya spent the next few days considering her next move. The nobles were watching, waiting for a sign of weakness, and Zoraya knew she had to act quickly. Her relationship with Tyrion, the bond they had rekindled after so many years, was now under the scrutiny of every noble and military leader. They feared the influence he had over her, the power he held in the military, and the loyalty he commanded from his soldiers. But Zoraya had never been one to bow to fear. She would not let her empire be torn apart by distrust and division. Zoraya had always been strong, but this time the challenges ahead seemed overwhelming. Still, she refused to back down. She would prove to everyone, not just the empire, but also herself, that she was capable of leading, that her strength didn't lie in the crown or the throne, but in her ability to do what was right for her people. She was the leader of this empire, and she would protect it, no matter the cost. She called for a private meeting with Tyrion. Later that day, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, Zoraya found him in the palace gardens again. He was sitting by the fountain, his hands resting on the stone edge as he stared into the water. His face was thoughtful, distant. He had always been someone who could carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but now it seemed as though he was carrying it alone. Zoraya's heart ached for him. She could feel the pain radiating from him, the sense of loss that he hadn't been able to fully express. Tyrion looked up when he heard her footsteps, his expression softening as their eyes met. "Zoraya," he said, his voice low and steady, though she could hear the strain in it. "You're here. Is everything all right?" Zoraya walked closer, her heart heavy with everything she needed to say. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "The Empire is at a crossroads. There's a storm brewing, and it's not just political, it's personal. People are questioning our loyalty to each other. There are whispers in the halls, in the courts, that we're divided, that I'm divided. But I won't let that happen. I can't." Tyrion looked at her, his expression guarded. "You don't have to do this alone, Zoraya. You've never had to." Zoraya sat beside him, her fingers brushing against his. "I know," she said softly. "But the Empire is my responsibility, and I know the challenges ahead won't be easy. But we're stronger together. I need you with me, Tyrion. Not just as a soldier, but as someone who understands what it means to fight for something greater than ourselves." Tyrion's gaze softened as he looked at her. "I've always fought for you, Zoraya," he said quietly. "And I always will. But I don't want to be a threat to you. I don't want my presence to cause division." "You're not a threat," she replied firmly. "You're a part of this empire, a part of my life. I won't let fear control us. I won't let fear take away everything we've fought for." Tyrion looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted power, Zoraya. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to protect you. But I realize now that I've been running from something I can't escape. I've been running from myself." Zoraya placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle yet firm. "You don't have to run anymore, Tyrion. Whatever you've been through, whatever you've been carrying, we can face it together." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the sound of the fountain softly filling the quiet air. Tyrion's shoulders seemed to relax, just a little. He looked up at her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I've spent so much time trying to protect everyone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've neglected the one person who needs my protection the most, myself. I thought I had to be perfect, to be the hero everyone needed. But I forgot that being human is enough, and that's something I need to remember if I'm going to move forward." Zoraya's heart ached at his words. She had known Tyrion for so long, but she had never truly understood the weight of what he had carried. He had been through hell and back, fighting not just for his people, but for her. Now, as they sat side by side in the fading light, she realized just how much he had sacrificed, and how much he had to offer, not just as a hero, but as a man. "You don't have to be perfect, Tyrion," she said softly, her voice full of understanding. "You just have to be you. And that's all I've ever wanted." Tyrion's eyes softened as he turned to her. "I don't know what the future holds, Zoraya," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But whatever happens, I'm with you, always." Zoraya smiled, feeling the weight of her own burdens lift just a little. "Then let's face it together," she said. "We'll rebuild this empire, not with fear, but with hope. We'll build a future that we can be proud of." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the cool evening breeze brushing against their faces as they watched the stars begin to twinkle above them. There were still many challenges ahead, still many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, Zoraya felt a sense of peace. Tyrion was no longer just the soldier who had saved the empire. He was no longer just the hero, the man who had been burdened with the weight of an entire galaxy. He was Tyrion, the man she had always known, the friend she had always trusted. And together, they would face whatever came next. Days turned into weeks, and Zoraya and Tyrion worked together to solidify their position. Zoraya knew that the whispers in the court would not simply fade away. She had to act decisively to show the Empire that she was the ruler, but that she was not alone. Tyrion was by her side, not as a rival, but as an equal. The people began to see the strength in their unity. The nobles who had once questioned Tyrion's loyalty began to see him for what he truly was, not a threat, but a man who had sacrificed everything for the good of the Empire. Slowly, the walls that had once divided them began to crumble. But Zoraya knew that the real work was only just beginning.